We've covered what family violence is in regards to Family Violence Act here in Aotearoa. Now we're going to explore the particular protections that are available to our respective community if they have been subject to family violence. Awesome.
Are we able to pull up the slide, Ivan, please?
So if you're just joining us for the first time, just want to acknowledge Ivan, our technical expert, who's been up all night trying to configure this new technology, this new platform. So thanks to Ivan, who's been actually instrumental in putting this morning together. So we'll go through the rights of migrants who experience family violence, and I'll let Lena take the lead on this particular topic.
Okay, so just moving on from where we started with. So obviously we've established what family violence is and how it might apply to the families that we're working with, all right? So we're talking about, right, is there a family relationship? And if there is a family relationship, is what is happening in that home enough to constitute the definition of violence under the Act? All right, so now if we've got those two things and we've said, yep, this is definitely a family that's experiencing family violence, what can we do to help them, all right? So if we go to the next slide. All right, so now that we've got this family violence, what are we going to do? What the Family Violence Act is, it offers three kinds of protections which are issued through the justice system to assist our families to one, get help, and two, get safe. All right, so these protections include, but aren't limited to, police safety orders, protection orders, and property orders. So what I'm going to do next is kind of give you a brief overview of what each of these orders are and how they come into fruition, let's say. So first, we'll start with the police safety orders.
So just before we go into police safety orders, it's important to note that irrespective of your client's residency status or visa, we have to remember that safety is paramount, right? And the law doesn't care about, well, it does care about your residency status, but it's afforded, that protection is afforded to absolutely everybody. So, I mean, obviously some people are scared to report violence because of fear of their residency status being revoked or being subject to review. But the main thing is that migrants are also afforded the same protections under the law as that of a New Zealand citizen or a permanent resident. So that's one of the clear things that we have to understand. It's just because I'm a migrant or my residency status is up in the air, I'm not provided the same protections. No, you're definitely afforded the same protections under the law if you have been subject to family violence.
Okay, so the first, this is something that happened as well when the new Family Violence Act came in, is that police safety orders have now been extended and there are further protections. Now, a police safety order are obviously issued by the police and they generally happen after a call out, okay? So say there's a big fight going on at home, somebody calls the police attend. The police have the ability to issue what we call a police safety order. And what that order does is it requires the person who is causing the fuss or causing the fight to be removed from the property, regardless of whether they own the home or a tenant in the home. It's basically to get the parties separated, all right? The police safety order can make this, the police can issue these safety orders out of their own volition. They can say, right, if we're talking about a mum and dad scenario, you know, dad's been drinking or he's on drugs or something like that, and we just want them to separate to calm the situation down. The police can then issue a safety order on the spot saying that the person who is causing the drama needs to be removed from the property for a certain amount of time, okay? Depending on the family situation, that can be for 48 hours, that can be for 5 days. It really varies on what's going on in the situation, all right? When the police attend, they will look for children in the home, because if there are children there, then they need to be making sure that those children are safe. if there is any kind of physical violence or smashing up of the house or whatever, the police are automatically required to alert Oranga Tamariki if there are children in that property. The police safety orders, what will basically happen is the police will fill in a form and they'll give a copy to the people remaining in the home, and they'll give a copy to the person who's being taken away. And that'll set out the time for which the police safety order is going to be in place for. And it gives certain rules about what can happen in that period, okay? It restricts, a police safety order will restrict the offender from having any contact with the victim or the family members for that period of time. It'll also restrict them from re-entering the home, because what we've seen before is that the police attend, there's a big bust up, and then dad says, fine, I'm leaving, takes off down the road. And then as soon as the police are, 10 minutes down the street, they come back. So the point of the police safety order is giving the family time to cool down, all right? So the police safety orders, as I said, they're issued by the police. They generally happen after a domestic incident in the home, and they will be put in place for a certain amount of time, okay? The police safety orders with the new act have the ability to be extended. So say if the police say, right, you can go for 48 hours, but then something happens in the intervening time, the victim or the family have the ability to call the police and say, look, we need some more time for more time to cool things down or for us to take steps. So they can approach the police and ask for the police to extend the time, the duration of the order. Cool.
So just remember, advising your client, first kind of protection that they can access or have is police safety order. And that's often, remember, it's issued by the police on a call out set for a specific amount of time, and it will set up the terms and conditions basically to cool both families down or both parties down, depending on the situation, and they'll be able to. Cool. So the second one is what we call protection orders. So protection orders have a different process, and I'll let Lena just walk through that particular process and the characteristics of this particular order.
Okay. So, as we said, the police safety orders, they're on the spot, issued by the police, and they basically happen in the heat of the moment, okay? Protection orders are a little bit different. Protection orders are applications made under the Family Violence Act to the family court, all right? So this is how you get a protection order. What will generally happen is you have the big bust up at home, the police will issue a safety order, and they'll generally recommend, depending on how bad the violence is, they might recommend to your families, you need to go and get a protection order. Now you can tell your families, well, you can go down to the court and fill in some forms and do it yourself, or you can send them off to a lawyer and ask them to make an application to the family court. Protection orders are very serious orders. They essentially set up a whole framework for the defendant and the victim as to how their relationship is going to continue into the future. What we have to remember is that with what we're talking about here, we're talking about families, we're talking about people who have relationships, who are required to be involved with each other, forever. If we're talking about family members, right? These aren't people that are going to go away. So what protection orders are there for is to protect families basically from any further family violence occurring, all right? Now, protection orders have quite a high threshold. I need to be really clear about this. And basically, if you're going to go to a lawyer or if you're going to make an application to the court, you need to meet certain criteria. What I've found is that there's a lot of misinformation about protection orders. People that we've worked with in the past there's kind of a misconception that you can just apply for one and you just need to write some things down and it's all good. It's not quite that simple. There are requirements that you have to establish with the court in order to get a protection order made. Okay, the first is obviously that there's been a domestic relationship or a relationship as defined by the Act. The second is that there's been family violence, which again we talked about before, so that it has to be sexual, psychological, or physical abuse. Now, the last one is necessity. This is the last limb of a protection order, and this is the one that quite often can be the most difficult to prove, all right? So the necessity limb of a protection order requires you, or your client or your family member to establish to the court that the protection order is absolutely necessary to keep them safe, okay? So protection orders tend to be in the heat of the moment kind of thing, all right? So when you go to a lawyer or when you make an application to the court will generally be asking, why is this necessary now, okay? So if you say, well, look, the general scenario that you're going to get is, we had a big fight at home on Saturday, the police came around, there was a police safety order issued. I'm really worried that when this police safety order expires, that person's going to come back and cause further family violence. So what I would then say as the lawyer or the person going to court is, well, this protection order is necessary because there's threat of further harm once the police safety order expires. So it's just about being really aware that you can't really have a domestic episode or a family violence episode, leave it for 6 months, and then come back and say, oh, well, we need a protection order now, all right? So it's all quite time limited, and that's something that we need to be reminding our families. While the definition is extended, to kind of include a pattern of behavior, like again, you have to be really sure that there's something happening right now that a protection order is necessary. So you can say, right, I've had financial abuse for however long and it's been going on, and you know, all these patterns create family violence, but there needs to be something happening at that time that puts this family at risk of harm. Cool. So necessity, like I said, requires protection to be in place for the protection of the victim and their children at the time of application. All right. The threshold is high. Obviously, you need quite a bit of evidence. What I would be telling all your families or the groups that you work with is, as much as they can when they're going to make an application, to try and build the evidence themselves. This is quite easy now because everyone puts everything on social media or texts, or a lot of it is there for the world to see. So when your families come in to talk to you about it, tell them any text messages they have to keep those. If there are things happening on social media, they should be screenshotting all of it, because all of that is helpful to the court if you're going to be making these applications. The applications are free to file. You can go and do them yourself. You can tell your families to go down to the court and fill in the forms. Because I'm a lawyer, obviously, I'm going to suggest that it's always easier to get legal assistance. Just because a lot of the stuff for our families is quite hard to talk about, and even harder to write about. So what we would always suggest is you go to somebody who's got that experience to help your family member or your person that you're trying to help put it all into writing so it makes sense to the court, and then they don't have to relive it by not only talking about it but writing it down and then presenting it to a judge. Okay.
Brilliant. So, I mean, at the top of the hour, we spoke about community law services or lawyers who do pro bono things. These are the kind of services. That's when you want to kind of get in touch with your local community law centre, is to help with these applications or help with these particular orders. All right, so they're able to navigate through. So, if you're like me and you like things in formulas kind of thing for the respective protection order, number one, is there a family relationship as defined in the Act, like we covered before? Has there been violence or abuse, as we covered before? And for the protection order, there's the third kind of element that you need, which is necessity. So is it absolutely necessary? And more importantly, at the time of application, so when you've actually applied for it. So it's necessity, and almost, is it imminent, like here and now, that I need this protection order to be granted. So you have those three elements, so the family relationship, the violence or the pattern of violence or instance of violence, and the necessity. Meet all three, then the courts are most likely to grant a protection order. Cool. And then the third respective tool, or the third protection order that you can apply for or look to be subject to, is.
So what we've talked about is we've got family violence going on. You've called the police, you've got a protection order. The third thing that you can apply for under the Family Violence Act is property orders. Because we're remembering that we're talking about whānau here. We're talking about people that live in the same house. Now, what we have what we have a lot of the time is our victims or our families saying, well, we don't want to call the police and we don't want to report any of this because where am I going to go? Okay. What we have a lot of the time is that, you know, mum and dad live in the house, dad's the primary earner, mum is, you know, looking after the kids at home, and there's all of this stuff going on, but she's saying, well, if I report it and I get a protection order, where are me and the children going to go? So what the Family Violence Act offers as well is property orders, which basically says that if you're in a home together, you've got the ability to make the other person leaves and have, if you're obviously renting a property, the tenancy being put in your name, or if you own the property, that you have the right of occupation, okay? Alongside that, you can apply for ancillary furniture orders, which basically means that everything in the house stays in the house for your benefit, and the person who is offended has to leave and leave everything there. We would generally recommend this when there are children in the home, because we don't want, you know, a family domestic violence situation to explode, and then dad leaves and he takes the fridge, the beds and all of that when mum's at home with the kids. So you can actually apply for these orders to protect the home environment for the family and have the perpetrator or the offender leave the home without kind of ripping the family house apart. So these property orders sit alongside protection orders. You can apply for them all at the same time, but they're really there to protect the home and property for the victim and the children. So generally, if there are children involved, we'd always suggest to have this put in place so that mum and the kids have somewhere safe for them to stay. Now, one of the things that I need to focus on is with protection and property orders, they are initially ordered for a set amount of time. A protection order, when you apply in the first instance, you will be granted with what we call a temporary protection order or a temporary property order. Those orders last for 3 months, and if they are not defended, then they go final and they last forever. So it's just about knowing that when you get these orders put in place, they're put in place for a set amount of time so that the family have realistically time to sort themselves out or find somewhere else to go and get supports in place for them and their children. Cool.
Yeah, cool. So just to recap, remember, those are the 3 legal tools that you can use, not just these tools, but for the purposes of our presentation, these are just the 3 most common ones that people will use to protect themselves from family violence. Police protection order, police safety orders, protection orders, and then property orders, all right? So we understand that perhaps, you know, if you've used all these particular tools to protect yourselves, that's certainly cool. But we also know that sometimes you might be working with family members or people who are the perpetrators of family violence. So let's look at what exactly, I guess, the consequences or, you know, family violence proceedings. So we'll look at defending family violence proceedings, and then if you're working with somebody who unfortunately is the perpetrator, just helping them understand what the kind of consequences are, or the gravity or the repercussions are of family violence.
Okay. So what we're trying to achieve here is really looking at both sides of the coin. It's easy enough for us to talk about the victims, but obviously it's a 2-man party. So what we wanted to kind of go over is what happens if the perpetrator comes to you and you are trying to help them through this process. Obviously, if there are children involved, that person needs to continue to have a relationship, and what kind of advice are you going to be giving them or helping them to kind of navigate their way through? What happens is once a protection order or a property order is issued, they are served on the defendant or the offender by the police, and they have a set amount of time to file a notice of response or a defence with the family court. Okay. If there is a protection order in place, the respondent is automatically required to complete a non-violence program or a living without violence program, depending on which area you're in. And they basically have to go off to one of these program providers and do an assessment as to whether they need to complete a full program or not. Now, if your client is served with a protection order and that requirement is in there, they've only got 7 days to object to having to attend the course. If they don't object within that 7 days, then they can actually be arrested if they don't go through and complete it later on. So these are the little things that we need to be mindful of. Once protection orders are put in place, the clock starts ticking, okay? So if you've got families or a client who's shown up and says, look, I've been served with these papers, I don't know what to do, it's really important that they understand and read through the paperwork that they've been given, because there will be timeframes, all right? So a notice of defence must be filed within 3 months, or the protection and property orders will go final. And like I said, they stay forever or until you file to remove them. They also need to be aware that there are non-violence programs that they will need to complete. And if they do not complete it, they can be subject to warrants being issued for their arrest. What we would generally be saying is, as soon as you've been served with a protection order, to get legal advice, because as you can tell from what I'm saying, there is a lot that goes into it, and there's quite strict timeframes. And basically, once a protection order is put in place, they can be quite difficult to take off. Same with the occupation and the property orders. So it is really good for them to get advice straight away, so that we know what we're dealing with and we can kind of help them navigate through what happens next.
So just remember, as soon as you see a protection order, the time is ticking. See your local community law centre, contact your lawyers or whatever, but just note that the time is ticking to object or defend, and then also ensure that they understand that they have to go to a non-violence program or so on and so forth. Cool. Sweet. So what are the consequences of family violence proceedings for, say, for example, a client that you're looking to assist, or someone who's come to you?
Yep. So family, like I said before, family violence proceedings are very serious. Protection orders are very serious. You can be charged in the criminal courts for a breach of a protection order. And if you breach a protection order 3 times, you're automatically liable for 3 months imprisonment. So again, it is really important for the people who are served with protections to understand what this all means, and how they are to behave around the family members who have issued the protection order against them. Obviously, the protection orders can have lifelong impacts and affect your personal and professional life, and essentially can also potentially affect your immigration status, which is something that we need to be really clear on, okay? Once a protection order is made final, it's there forever, or until such time that you apply to the family court to remove it. If you have children in the future, you have to be really aware that should concerns arise about your children, that protection order will be dragged out and brought before the courts. So you need to, this is what we're trying to be really aware of, is that we need all our families to take these really seriously, and to get advice either from a community law centre or from a legal aid lawyer or whatever, just so that they are aware of the implications should they just choose to ignore it. And to be quite frank, that's what happens a lot of the time. So it's just about keeping our families really informed about what this all means for them going forward.
Yeah, we'll touch a little bit about immigration status and the impact that it has. So if you're a migrant and you're on a current visa and you've been served a protection order or police safety order, when you go to reapply, those particular orders will come up. And there's particular tests, and they will take that into consideration when they look to grant or to renew your visa. Those particular things can obviously serve as a stain, perhaps, on, for lack of a better term, on your respective applications. So it's really important that we communicate that to the clients that we work with on both sides, whether they're victims of it or perpetrators, depending on whoever comes to your respective service, just ensuring that as soon as we receive any or be subject to any one of these particular protection orders, get advice straight away and just communicate to them the importance of these particular of action, ensuring that we actually move ahead. So we'll just look at this last particular slide before we wrap up this particular section of protections for migrants. So there's just two more slides.
Yeah. So obviously, if you have, we've talked a little bit about what happens with people that are served with protection orders, but what happens to the victims? So now that all these orders are in place, what kind of advice are we giving to the victims? What we always suggest as a standard is that we always inform our families to reach out to as many counselling and support people as possible. This is where organisations like yourselves really matter to us, okay? Because obviously if you're living in a family environment and these big explosive things happen, our families are going to suffer, our children are going to be affected, and if it's our women are going to find themselves at a bit of a loss, especially if they are not the main breadwinners. So what we always suggest is that you reach out to as many community organisations as you can. There are obviously ethnic and culturally specific programs available all over the country. So what we'd be doing is obviously pushing them back to the community organisations to see how they can help, okay?
So important one, the ethnic and culturally specific programs. So we acknowledge that a lot of the issues are taboo in many topics, but with a specific, with an ethnic specific program, they're cognizant of the cultural values and cultural norms of that respective culture. So we highly encourage that you as a practitioner are aware of the specific ethnic programs that can help your respective clients that you're working with, and it just enables them to kind of open up a bit more and foster that sense of cultural appropriateness when dealing with our clientele. So we know that a large number of services are European based, but those values aren't necessarily compatible with a lot of our communities. So we just encourage you, get a hold or know the respective community organisations that provide the ethnic specific support programs for our respective communities.
Yeah. And just that last point, we have to remember that especially for our women or our families, is that they will be under a lot of pressure, especially in cultural contexts, to kind of go back into these families, you know, to preserve the mana of the family. And this is quite common in a lot of our migrant families. So it's just something that we need to be cognizant about, which is why we would always suggest that these support services are really important. Because as we know, sometimes our families, as much as they love us, sometimes don't always get it right. So it's just about having these independent people who are there to kind of protect our families and make sure that the right protections are there and in place. Cool. So this is, the next slide is just what I want to wrap up with. We're talking about families here, we're talking about mums and dads, we're talking about partnerships, and the question that always comes up is what happens if they reconcile, okay? One thing that we want to be really clear on is if the family decide to reconcile and they go through all these programs or they decide that they want to get back together, that is actually okay, all right? It's fine. It's not something that we can stop, all right? But what we want to be making sure of is that there's two kinds of elements that both parties understand. One, that consent is crucial, okay? So nobody can be pressured to re-enter into the relationship. And the victim has to give full and informed consent that that person is going to be allowed back in their home, back in their family, and back around their children, all right? The victim can withdraw consent at any time, and they can ask the defendant or the offender to leave if they become violent, threatening, or inappropriate. So from the victim's perspective, they need to know that as long as they feel okay, they can be together, right? From the defendant's point of view, they need to be careful, that they need to be very sure that they're protecting themselves. What the Family Violence Act now says is that all consent should be in writing. So a text message is very helpful for both parties. Absolutely. Just so that everyone's protect themselves, all right? And what the defendant needs to know is that the minute that the victim says, enough, you're scaring me, you're threatening me, whatever, that they get out of there quick smart, okay? Because as I said, if protection orders are breached and you're found to be in a position where you shouldn't be, it can result in the criminal courts becoming involved, which we don't want to do, all right? So what happens is with the consent, it falls on the defendant to know when to leave, and it is their responsibility to get themselves away. Context is really key. So what we would always be saying is that, look, if you're going to be reconciling or reuniting and we've got children in the mix, that the victims always need to be looking at the context at how this happens, okay? Make sure that any contact in the initial stages is safe, monitored, and in spaces where help or support is nearby, all right? So this is just general stuff that we're telling our families all the time. If you're going to be meeting up with dad after you've had this big blow up and the police were called and we've had orders and stuff, if you're going to be going into those spaces, just making sure that when you enter that space with that person, that it's all safe, right? So general things like if you're going to be meeting up, make sure there's another family member there, do it in public, or you know, just be around other people so that if things escalate, you're not putting yourself at risk. The defendants are the people that are going in, the offenders who have protection orders against them. Make sure that we're texting each other, just so that, you know, you can't say, well, she called me and she said it was all good for me to be here, and then you get there and they call the police and then the whole thing explodes. It's a matter of just each person in this relationship taking steps to keep themselves safe, and that's something that I would be suggesting to the community workers to be really strict about, okay? Children are always going to be the soft point for our families, and that's the truth. All parties must always be acting to keep themselves safe, but also to be making sure that our children are safe, because realistically they can't protect themselves. So it's up to both adults in these situations to be making sure that any of the consent and the context of any contact is safe for the children first and foremost. Cool.
Cool, folks. So I know that was a pretty dense kind of part of the presentation. So just bear in mind, so that's the 3 protection orders that you've got accessible. If people come to you, just know that protection order time is running. Just if you're advising defendants, say, just ensure that they're accessing the program, that they understand to object, and then just realizing that, hey, consent, and they can reconcile at any particular time. So folks, we'll just park it there for a minute before I just turn my attention to special visas and migrants. But we'll just park it there for a minute, and this particular section will only take about 5 minutes or so. And we'll just have a quick break because I know there was a bit of a dense kind of topic. And bear in mind, this is recorded, and we'll try to address your questions once we get to the end. And then from there on in, we'll smooth sail and quickly wrap up with legal aid before we pass it on to Shirleen, and then that will be basically us. Cool, so we'll just break for a minute or so. I'll be back.